Innovation in the military, in our military, cyber, and space industries isn't optional. It's imperative. The United States must lead the way in all these domains. It's imperative. The United States must lead the way without innovation, the nation will not stay ahead of the competition. What can the U.S. do to stay competitive? I'd like to introduce Mark Maybury, CTO at Stanley Black & Decker, who will moderate the next panel. You have all the answers.
Well, I certainly have the questions. Thank you so much. Well, first of all, let me congratulate Megan Torrey at the World Affairs Council, and of course, also thank Matt Fleury for his wonderful hosting here. I will admit my bias as a member of the, really grateful member of the Board of Trustees here at the Science Center. We are really privileged to help contribute to the advancement of science, which is, we all know is not only essential to economic power, it's fundamental to military power. Today, I'd just like to take a moment before we start to recognize all the men and women in uniform across the world. There are especially tens of thousands of them presently, troops in contact oftentimes overseas. They're providing the safety and security that we all enjoy here today, and especially a salute to those members of the uniformed profession who are here with us today. They really do provide our lives, our liberty, and our happiness. I'm reminded that we are having this conversation in the midst of what we at Stanley Black & Decker call, my CEO Jim Lurie calls a VUCA world, which of course he adopted about 15 years or so ago. The Army actually did a study on the volatility, the uncertainty, the complexity, and the ambiguity, and there's no more beautiful way to describe this challenging world we live in. It is contested, it is congested, and it is competitive. And that's going to be the focus of what we are emphasizing today. Indeed, it's one in which the battle is a fight for hearts and a fight for minds. And I'm reminded of that great philosopher, Hercules, who said once, "A true hero is not measured by the size of his strength, but by the strength of his heart." And with that, I'd really much like to briefly introduce our two fantastic speakers today. Our panelists come from two very different sectors, but actually, shockingly, these are extremely intertwined, as many things are today. Our first speaker, Sarah Maniero, Senior Director for Space Strategy at Anduril Industries, has got really an extraordinary background. And I'm not going to go through it because you can read it, but I have to highlight the fact that in fact she, before this exciting position that she holds, and she, as any great professional, self-effacingly calls herself a space nerd. But trust me, she is anything but a space nerd. She is amazing. She was the staff lead for the Strategic Forces Subcommittee for the House Armed Services Committee, the HASC. She's led all the legislative and oversight activities for the DoD's Defense and Military Intelligence Program. For those of you who spent time inside the building know how just critical that is for the space programs, for nuclear weapons, for missile defense, for directed energy, and hypersonics, just in case she got bored. She is actually an expert in not one, but a multiplicity of technologies, working and advising Ranking Member Mac Thornberry on all strategic forces. She also did a stint prior to that, had multiple careers at OSDP in policy, and before that working at my prior organization, the United States Air Force, working for the Undersecretary for Air Force for International Affairs. So she has actually an amazing technical and policy background, and indeed my favorite piece of her background is she actually worked at the National Air Intelligence Center, one of my favorite places in the world in Dayton, Ohio. Of course, I admit it as former chief scientist of the Air Force, but nonetheless, it was a fun, as she was describing just yesterday, it was an extraordinary experience coming out of school. And if any of you have had experience with NASIC, you know just what a privilege to be in that portion of the intelligence community. She, of course, has incredible academic credentials as well. I'm not going to go through those. Is an advisor to the Defense Innovation Space Advisory Committee and also the Board of Directors of the United States Space Force Association. So please join me in welcoming Sarah. Sarah is sitting next to Jason Crabtree, who himself is an amazing gentleman, a co-founder of QOMPLX and actually CEO. He actually, of course, manages all the operations of that quite interesting company. But if you look at his background, it's quite extraordinary as well. He, of course, is an expert on many dimensions of cybersecurity, data, risk management, some of the topics that actually came up in the previous panel. He has actually been featured on none less than ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, Fox News, CNBC, and before I run out of breath, he not only is represented in multiple publications, as well, importantly, in a number of the many agencies around the Beltway. He actually also is published by my alma mater, Cambridge University Press. So that puts him close to my heart. Is also a graduate of West Point, where he was actually selected as first captain and brigade commander of the Corps Cadets, and he later became a Rhodes Scholar. I didn't make that. I only became a Rotary Scholar. I did compete for the Rhodes, but I didn't get picked. So he's clearly, you got the brains sitting down there. He, of course, has also led infantry troops in Afghanistan. And so we thank him for his service. And I think at this juncture, we should get into the great questions with this panel. So again, please join me in welcoming Jason. So we're going to jump right into it. Megan and Jason, let's go ahead and start with the focus of the conference theme. The theme of the conference, of course, is competing for the future. My question to both of you is just who are we competing with? What are we competing about? And why are we competing? For what purpose? So what are your perspectives?
Yeah, I mean, I'll start. What are we competing for? I am kind of an unabashed believer in American exceptionalism, believer in democracy and the freedoms that gives all of us the right to be able to enjoy. And so I think that's really what we're competing about. I think it's very easy to say we're competing for military dominance, we're competing for international alliances. I think it's also very easy to look at competition as a zero-sum game, especially in the last couple of years when you're talking about partnerships and alliances and how that all gets framed in foreign policy. I will say that I think it's very easy and simplistic to say that we are competing against China and Russia as our strategic peer competitors, and I believe that that is true. I will also acknowledge that increasingly I think we're competing against ourselves, and we're competing against a baseline of civility where we're able to disagree without being disagreeable. We're able to have rigorous discourse from fundamentally different perspectives and be able to respect that and move forward in a productive way. And you know, when we talk about competition, it's not just a competition externally, but it's a competition for ourselves and our industrial base and our national security mechanisms to be as supportive and productive and efficient and innovative for the future as possible.
Just before we pivot to Jason, I have to follow up on that last comment, which I think is magnificent, about competing for ourselves and civility. I'm wondering, as you were speaking, I was thinking, why? Boy, science really has, we're here in one of the cathedrals of science, really has a wonderful role model in the sense of competing for, well, we think something and no, we actually find more knowledge, and actually the discourse, even the economics, people talk about giving a paper. You don't sell your paper, right? You give a talk, right? You hold a panel, right? So I'm kind of curious, is that a good model for us to learn from science, or are there other models to get toward that civility?
Yeah, you can get real philosophical on this, and I will avoid doing that. But there's some really interesting books out there and discourses on this. I mean, I think at the end of the day, I am a believer in science. I am a space nerd. I'm also like an art nerd, which is terribly subjective, right? I'm a music nerd. I'm a comic book nerd. I'm just kind of a nerd all around. But you know, at the end of the day, science is important insofar as it's objective, and you can be able to you know, look at that. I think the trend right now, and I think the acknowledgement right now, is that science is, you cannot divorce it from the lens. It is a social experiment. To be able to observe something scientifically also requires the acknowledgement of the community which is observing it. And so it is an interesting discourse. And so I'm not here to say that science is 100% objective in all of its fact. There are undisputable facts that are found through scientific method. I believe that scientific method, though, does imply the existence and the acknowledgement of others.
Jason, back to the original question. What are we competing for? Who are we competing with? Why are we competing?
Yeah, I think building on maybe some of Sarah's comments, I think one of the things that a lot of people misunderstand about the kind of competition that we're in is that we aren't just competing with China or Russia. And certainly you can pick whether nation-state adversaries, we can talk about the kinds of ideas that have been out there when we think about some of our past experience since 9/11, thinking maybe a little bit more cogently about counterterrorism today than maybe we did 20-some years ago. At the end of the day, we're competing with what is it that we're going to be as a society, and how does that manifest? And I think, we're sitting in a hall of science, but the reality is that good scientific thinking has limits. Empiricism has limits. And I think it's going to be really important for us that we balance theory and we balance some this is maybe a small plea for thinking about, liberal arts education alongside STEM, is that scientists have to think about what it is that they're creating, how that's going to be used or abused or misused. And often we don't do that. And that's part of why you have the cybersecurity challenges that we have. It's part of the challenges that we've had with a lot of other very disruptive technologies. And I think the more that you see a lot of these small component technologies mature, and there are a ton of them that are maturing right now, that are disrupting this balance between cost and consequence. It's no longer a whole bunch of people in pitchforks to raise an army and have a nation state impact. It's $500 in a home lab kit, and you can go synthetically create a bioweapon. You can do something to disrupt an entire economy with a small group of people who really understand computers. That has tremendous consequences for an organization or a country like the United States that traditionally could observe things. Even nuclear weapons, while maybe compact, were observable. Most of DARPA's history is about observing nuclear weapons. So we have to start to think about what is it that we want to build in as a world, and what is the human condition that we're endorsing alongside all the science. And that debate and that battle that we're facing is every bit as cogent for disinformation and the political discourse and misinformation. And whether that's Chinese-sponsored misinformation or whether that is any other form of radicalism, it doesn't really matter. It ends up manifesting in the way that it skews society and our investments and our discourse about the society we're forming.
Your comments, Jason, remind me of the kind of dualism that Hercules talked about, right? The physics, the strength, and the emotion, right? The hearts, in that battle, and thinking about the societal implications of technologies and the like. And it reminds me, actually, your comment of, our fear initially with some of the initial, attacks on the election system was, they're going to attack the ballot box. And then, they're going to cyber attack it and so on. And then we realize, wait a minute, they'll just use social media. And it's just another example, sort of like 9/11, of an inventive adversary who says, where is the weak link that I can get at the outcome that I want to achieve. So it's really is a challenging world. And I guess I'd like to ask a follow-up to both of you, if you have anything more, because this is such a fascinating question. Are there other ways to compete for the future, maybe that get less attention but are equally urgent?
Yeah, I call this the unsexy parts of innovation, and there's a lot of them, and they're all terribly unsexy. But they are also terribly necessary. And a couple of them were touched on the previous panel, right? It's about looking at your industrial base, making sure, especially in the space sector where I spend a lot of my time, that industrial base is fundamentally changing. From where you were seeing, 15, 20 years ago, which was basically kind of hardware manufacturing kind of focused industrial base where you're literally building satellites or rocket engines or rocket launching systems, to, quite frankly, much more of a service-based economy, much more of a commoditization of the hardware, but quite frankly, a lot of software and kind of service-based kind of business models and services that are being pushed out. And so, it's terribly, not interesting to most people because it's not the big thing that goes boom on the launch pad. but it is the thing that actually makes space systems useful to the warfighters and to the tactical operators, right? Because at the end of the day, the Army and the soldier in the field does not really care where his information or where his comms comes from or her comms comes from. They care that they have comms. They care that they have that imagery or that weather data or that information that is necessary for them to carry out their mission. And whether that comes from a space platform, whether that comes from an airborne platform, most of the operators in the field don't really care about. And so the question then becomes, what are these necessary networks, data transport layers? What are the necessary ways in which you're pushing that system down? And quite frankly, that gets a lot into what Jason does and a lot of the cyber aspects, because space is increasingly being recognized as another domain, a domain that we operate in. But the question is, how do you push all of that information through the relevant domains to the people who actually need it?
Yeah, I think for me, when you start to again, I'll maybe build on Sarah's comments, the reality is that you have this need to be both hierarchical and cooperative. And when you think about this way of how do you construct communications mediums for especially a mission-oriented kind of command structure where you want to sort of drive different kinds of decentralized execution and centralized policy, maybe to echo aspects of the last piece and the last panel, that's hard to do in practice. It requires interoperability not only at a technical systems layer, but it requires operability at what we would call a semantic layer, a layer of the meaning. And that's really, really important if you want to drive semantic interoperability between different services that have different languages, right? You have this Tower of Babel problem. Lots of different tools, lots of different technologies, lots of different people, lots of different cultures. So you have to be very choiceful about where is it that you force harmonization or synchronization. And if you do it in the wrong way, you end up creating really big, expensive programs that fail because they're overly prescribed and they're too limited and they're not responsive. And if you do it in no way, you end up with everybody speaking their own independent language and none of it works together, and you end up with all of these fragments that never coalesce. And I think one of the challenges that we have to get much more precise on when we're talking about innovation is, are we trying to do fundamental types of research, or we're trying to identify the degree to which something can produce doctrinal or frankly technological surprise? And are we trying to ascertain the degree to which that might exist? Is this in the realm of what might happen, and on what kind of timescales could they be matured into operational consistency? Or are we in fact trying to determine if we can adopt something at scale and employ it throughout our forces? And I think one of the challenges that we've been facing, if you look at a lot of the ways that I'll critique some of the recent innovation programs, and including a lot of the OTAs that were mentioned earlier, is they often don't do a good job of actually pairing the operator with the technology in an integrated fashion so that you co-evolve them. And so if you go back, and I'll pick on World War I history since there's some cadets in the room, go pick up, Bruce Gudmundson's stormtroop tactics and go look at why is it that the Germans do a better job of developing breakout siege warfare tactics based on British and American writings that they can never get the units trained on, but that the Germans do. It's because they co-integrated doctrinal and technological innovation, and then they drived it, out into the organization, and they were able to short circuit something. But we have to acknowledge that building a rifle and building a submarine are not the same things. And when we confuse the two, just like in the digital space, are we building fundamental computing infrastructure and communications infrastructure? Or are we building toy algorithms because somebody stamped a machine learning sticker on it? Very different process for thinking about what it is that you're purchasing, and we sometimes paint it with a single color.
So let's dig a little bit deeper into the technologies. We've heard a bunch branded about today, additive manufacturing, model-based architectures, quantum, AI, blockchain wasn't mentioned yet, which is amazing, et cetera.
Keep it that way.
Maybe picking up a little bit on your comment, Jason, are there critical technologies? I mean, Putin thinks whoever owns AI is going to own the world, and President Xi certainly believes that AI and quantum and other technologies they're doubling down. So I'm just kind of curious, are there important strategic technologies, and how are we doing in those?
Yeah, so for me, I think you could take something like quantum, which everyone wants to talk about and should get talked about at NSA or Google or Microsoft or certain places like that, but most of the market has no business discussing it at all. It's too expensive, it takes too long, it has none of the technological readiness or maturity, it is foundationally not aligned with the way that we write software or that we productize that software, so it's ghastly inappropriate for almost everyone to talk about. Doesn't mean America and the defense sector and the intelligence sector doesn't need to deal with it, because there are some fantastic implications if it's real. But I think we have to do a much better job of making sure that we don't confuse ourselves about the difference between that and thinking about narrow AI systems, for example, where we can think about image classification and co-integration of data, or to build on the model and sort of base design pieces. If you think about some of the tremendously powerful things that synthetic data can do, whether that's the same techniques that are used for stuff like deepfakes, which is creating a societal problem and creates a security problem, creating effectively convincing evidence that never existed. You can also do things that are the equivalent of that. What tiny percentage do self-driving cars actually drive in the real world? Hardly any of it. Tiny fractions of a percent are driven by a real car on a real road. Most of it is all effectively driven in a big elaborate video game. It's SimCity. So it doesn't matter if it's CAD that became building information management in the civil engineering space, and same thing that we're hearing about with all the mechanical engineers that were up here, co-integrated systems and assembly development. Same thing needs to be happening across the rest of how we procure and integrate our physical parts and our software parts. Where we have to be really careful though, and this is where I think, again, I'll exercise maybe some limited critique of some of the new government initiatives. If you look at how JIAC, the Joint AI Center, or if you think about some of the things with Air Force Platform One, let's just be honest, that is categorically not the role of government in some of those key areas. And some of those initiatives are grossly out of line compared to emerging best practices in the industry, and are at best a second or third class implementation of things that are widely available commercially at much higher cost, at much lower development times. And now contractors are being told to build software for an already outmoded way of managing a lot of those artifacts, which is going to continue to degrade it under the auspices that a bunch of these cadets are all going to become expert coders. No problem, some of you might, but that's probably not your role. And so I think we have to be really careful in pretending everybody's going to do a coding boot camp and end up being an AI wizard, because that's probably not the future of what we want for soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines. And I don't know how to say space people correctly, so
Space Guardians.
Space Guardians, okay, I've been
Yeah.
officially educated. But I think this is exactly where we have to be really careful about how private and partner, public intersections here are actually going to occur as we go forward. And we're not doing it quite right yet, in my view.
So unless you want to comment on the technology transfer, I want to pivot and go a little bit deeper. There's a massive volume, to your point, Jason, of investment going into the private sector. In the last 10 years, the global R&D investment doubled from $1.22 trillion to $2.4 trillion. This year alone, I just looked this up, there's $271 billion in venture capital. That's more, it's about 251 all of last year. And it wasn't that things slowed down during COVID. Actually, they actually increased. So my question is, given this volume, variety, and velocity of investment in the private sector, really picking up on your point, is what's the DoD or the intelligence community to do? What is the right public-private partnership? And why don't we start with you, Sarah, and then we'll continue, Jason.
This is a really interesting point, because we are at this inflection point where we have a tremendous amount of VC money that's coming in, especially into the space sector, where it appears if you have a CAD drawing and two dudes in a clean room, you're going to spack out in 2 years and everyone's going to be a couple $1 million richer, regardless of whether you actually got a satellite on orbit or not. But that's a thing. Okay. On the other hand, space has really benefited tremendously from robust public-private partnerships, especially, when we talk about, and people in the DoD talk about the other transactional authority. The other transactional authority started in 1958 through NASA. It is what helped us get to the moon, y'all, right? Like, that is a thing. NASA knows how to use it. It was not until the early 1990s that the DoD actually was given the legislative authority and then actually started to roll out and really use OTAs. And a couple of years prior to that, DARPA had actually kind of started that as well. And so, there is a tremendous history and a robust history and a productive history of public-private partnerships on at least the NASA and the civil side for space. I think on the DoD and the national security front, coupled with this rise in venture capitalism and venture capital money that's flowing into the sector, what you're really seeing is, quite frankly, and I like to try to give the DoD the benefit of the doubt here, is there's just a lot of confusion about what is real out there, about who are the real companies that are actually going to be able to deliver capabilities on spec and on time. And so, you have all of these companies that kind of flood in, and what you don't have is a lot of diligence on how viable those companies are, what their supply chain security looks like, and what their business product and productization will be in the future. And that's a real place where I think the DoD has struggled, and quite frankly, I think that industry owes a better answer to them on that.
Yeah, I think one of the things that the Department of Defense has to start to manage, and I do think some of this is going to start to bleed into looking at areas where there may be need for reform, is a lot of the federal acquisition programs are really designed to try and preclude the misuse of money. And that's a good thing, right? There's a lot of reasons why we should want that as a society. Back to where we started this whole conversation, what kind of world do we want to live in? I think it's also really important to acknowledge that if you have an acquisition system that's focused on not losing, it's not very focused on winning. And we have a lot of things that we do that are focused not on winning, they're focused on not losing. And if you start to reform the question to say, how is it that we're embracing and taking risk, and how is that risk manifest in the kinds of units, and whether they're intelligence or military or civilian types of applications, right? There's a lot of military, defense support civil agencies, things with the Corps of Engineers, for example, all kinds of other stuff that's a big part of our country. How do you actually empower folks that have the mission to use acquisitions as a resource in that organize, man, train, and equip part that the services do versus our combatant commands or versus other parts of our organization, and think about that delineation? That's becoming even harder in a digitally enabled world. So one of the things you're starting to see now, for example, is the challenge for a traditional service and a combatant command. So combatant command says, hey, as soon as you assign a unit to me, it's mine. I can use it for anything I want. And it comes with all these great digitally enabled bells and whistles that all phone home. Well, what happens when an asset in CENTCOM is deemed to be vulnerable to a cyber attack, and because of all the other missions in the world, the CENTCOM commander is told you can't play with that toy anymore? This happens. So how do you start to think about the degree to which those missions and those capabilities are severable and can be powered into the kinds of deployable forces unit structures that we have on the mission side, not the man, train, and equip side?
Well, the good news in the future is you're not going to be able to ask either of those because they're not going to own them. They're going to be owned by SpaceX or some other, but we'll get to that in just a moment. Just to be a bit controversial, we're going to open it up to questions, and we'll wait for the hands to go up. And I'm going to ask a question to both of you while we're waiting for the first question. So that's your signal to ask, to think about your question. Is we're in a cathedral of STEM, and clearly this is all about the people. So what do we need to do to make sure we win the war for talent, not just amongst our defense industrial base contractors and the military, et cetera, but against the world, if you will, or the future, a better future?
Yeah, I mean, I think. Look, I think part of it is the strength of our military, the strength of our diplomatic corps. I will tell you that, I work my day job, I work at a VC-funded hypergrowth startup in AI, ML. Like, it's got all the buzzwords of all the Silicon Valley everythings. And I love it, and it's super cool. And at the end of the day, the thing that I think we're innovating for, and the thing that brings back for me every day is that, I've never taken a job where I couldn't have at least 2 instruments at my desk. This is even like when I worked on the Hill, or in the intelligence community, or wherever the heck I work. Because at the end of the day, I fully recognized, and it's kind of a difficult thing to do when you're in like the intelligence community, or you're working for the Secretary of Defense, or you're working for a specific congressman, on the Hill or whatever. But at the end of the day, like, I was very self-assured of who I was and who I wanted to be. I'm very self-assured that I want that kind of liberty and freedom for my kids and for other people. And one of the ways that you do that is by supporting our national security complex. And that's the way in which I have chosen to serve. And I think that's how you win the innovation war, right? You don't win the innovation war by neglecting people. You win the innovation war by valuing people and by valuing diversity and by valuing the whole person and not just the contribution that they're making at their 9 to 5.
Well said.
Yeah, I think for me, it's really important that we invest in, education and training, and I put a really bright line between them, right? I think we confuse that a lot in a lot of the discourse around innovation, especially in the AI, ML, coder camp stuff, right? Big difference between understanding the mathematics you want to apply and understanding how to tactically apply a particular kind of algorithm. We see this a lot in engineering programs as well, right? People can use software and they have no idea what it means when it plugs together. I think it's really important that we do both, and organizations have to think about how they're adopting those things. I think one of the uniform aspects of this that really matters is, are we actually building, a society that you're proud in? Are you part of a company that you're proud in? Are you part of a mission that you're proud in? And I think America has a great mission. And I think there's a lot of people that are going to want to continue to be a part of that. And you see that with a lot of folks all over the world that still want to come here, and people that want to make the country great. But ultimately, for us to do that, we have to try and develop technology that's consistent with the way that we want to behave, and we have to see that technology get applied. And one of the biggest detriments, I think, to people either not staying in the service or people that might be a part of the national security apparatus that aren't comfortable with it for one reason or another, is if we don't make it really clear how disruptive technologies or powerful technologies are integrated in a way that's consistent with our values as a country, and that your work isn't going to go on a shelf. If you see your work applied and you get to go meet the people on the mission that get to adopt it and figure out how it helped them stay alive or keep someone alive or do some of the things that they needed to do, that's really, really rewarding. And it's a hell of a lot more fun than doing something just in the lab. We've got to do more to get that co-integrated development together.
Very good, very good. Do we have questions from the audience?
Up here, sir.
I'm sorry, there we go.
So as a West Point cadet, it would be remiss of me not to acknowledge a West Point graduate and former first captain, sir. It's good to see a West Point grad on the panel. My question, though, is for Ms. Mineiro.
It's close enough, yeah, we're good. I'll take that.
I heard that some of your background involves hypersonic weapons, and I'm sort of curious, can you explain how we stack up against the Chinese in that realm?
Great question.
Yeah, so the question was how we stack up against China in the world of hypersonics. Not well. We have had a couple of recent successes. I think the Air Force just recently, this past week, successfully flew Hawk for the first time. Great, it's all good. I think all of the services, and within the past 2 years, the Army and the Navy have really stepped up with OSD oversight to be developing a more comprehensive roadmap to strategic hypersonics for the United States. That seems to be going well. The Army's done a fantastic job at creating and recognizing an industrial base for production. The Navy has done a fantastic job at thinking about the engineering of the reentry vehicle as well as some of the launch considerations. I will tell you that the Chinese have the benefit of being a communist country that is completely state-directed and has had their eye on this ball for a long time. There has been a significant lull in DoD kind of development and testing of hypersonics for the past kind of 10 years. That is we're just now starting to come out of that. I will tell you that the biggest worry that I have at this point is not necessarily kind of the China hypersonic and the Russia hypersonic, and quite frankly, those are architected to be different things, right? Strategic and non-strategic and regional. The biggest concern that I have right now is our ability to defend against incoming hypersonics, right? And so that needs to be thought about as well, and I think we are woefully behind on defense against hypersonics as a nation.
Well said, great question. We have another question, I think, here, and in back. You've got the mic. You've got the mic with the power.
I am an immigration attorney, and I deal with a lot of talent, STEM talent, who would love to work for the defense industry. But due to the ITAR and all sorts of other regulations, they are unable to participate in your talent force until at least until they become U.S. citizens, or at most, permanent residence plus 5 years of residence. And there are extraordinary engineers from all over the world, from allied countries, who would love to work here for you on a green card, but they can't. Any thoughts on any changes to legislation that would enable that type of talent to join you? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to maybe take this one. So, I just did a panel on a similar topic with, Ro Khanna, who's the Silicon Valley congressman, and Jeb Bush. And I think one of the things that we talked about there that I'll echo here is that our graduate programs and universities, in my view, ought to come with a green card. Congratulations on getting your mechanical engineering PhD. We hope you'll never leave. We need to do a lot more of that. And I think that that's going to be really important for us if we want to think about driving global competitiveness. You've seen over the last decade a lot of tremendous engineering and science and technology programs spring up where other parts of the world have now world-class research universities, not just universities, research universities, with tremendous partnerships with global aerospace providers, with other types of global technology infrastructure. That's not that the pie can't get larger and support prosperity around the world, but I'd like to start at home. And so I think when we think about that, we ought to be continuing to watch the amount of global research and development dollars that are with U.S. universities and the degree to which we can keep that talent here on a perpetual basis. There's more than enough opportunity at work. There's not enough talent.
Yeah, I would just add to that it's actually far worse than Jason articulated. I've been tracking this for about 20 years.
It's a disaster.
And the numbers, it's a disaster is a better way to describe it. And indeed, our competitors, like, for example, China with 1,000 Talents program, and we can go into other examples of it, have systematically been stealing our intellectual property, and now our intellectual property generation machine, our people. And I just encourage you to read up as that is just one example, but there are a multiplicity of examples. The gentleman we just had on the stage previously, their companies have been ravaged in terms of their intellectual property for the past, I would say, at least decade, if not longer. And the good news is that used to be classified information. Now we actually can tell you what weapon systems have been extracted. And so, my personal view, you can see I'm a bit passionate about this, is that having worked on the Defense Science Board for quite a while and have had the sad privilege of observing this, is that we are at a competitive disadvantage. We're tying our hands behind our back. We're not letting the talent flow in. I think Jason's point is an excellent one from yourself and your panel with respect to green card holders. We need to, and I'm not saying we open up the floodgates, but I'm saying exactly as you articulated, we'd be clever about encouraging folks. And it's unfortunate because the good news is the world, in spite of the challenge in the pandemic, the world has actually gotten more egalitarian in the sense that you can have a pretty high quality life in parts of the world where 20 years ago it would have been much more difficult. That means also there's technology, there's capability in those parts of the world that mean we're going to have to compete on a much more equal basis. So we can't afford to quote, take the high ground. And I don't mean we undermine our American values. We maintain those values, but we compete hard for that talent. I think it's going to be essential to our future. It's a great question. Give another question.
Thank you. I've heard a lot in the past 2 sessions about really manufacturing better weapons, manufacturing, keeping talent to manufacture, all that. But it seems like those are still weapons that could be in danger of cyber attacks as well. So with, even with the F-15s and all that, it was great that we had the fastest plane, but the armies that used the F-15s were busy knocking out missiles through cyber warfare. And we've seen a lot of hackers now and I think you've said something, $500 in a laptop. Where are we in terms of cybersecurity? Because if we're going to be spending all these trillions of dollars, but we lose the electronic warfare, we're going to knock out all these trillions of dollars. So where are we there? It seems like other countries, not only China and the Soviet Union, but smaller countries are also getting to be a place where they can level the playing field just by just through cyber warfare.
You want to take that one?
Sure. So I think one of the best ways to get better at cybersecurity is stop digging. The reality is the country is not secure, and you see that in the news, right? It's I think pretty reasonably easy to extrapolate, to be honest. And the defense base is largely not that secure. And so I think we have a lot of work to do. I think one of the challenges for people, though, is things like CMMC, which sound good, are mostly about paperwork and not about security, maturity, and operations. And so no different than some of the reasons why we can build and integrate a better plane or a fighter or a better, submarine or some of the other things that we're talking about since we're here in Connecticut. A lot of those same missteps for stolen intellectual property that led to some pretty fantastic failures from technology that was obviously ripped off and shoved into other systems without that whole systems design, whole systems engineering. A lot of that happens in the cybersecurity world as well. You have to have the people, you have to have the process, you have to know actually how to integrate these things together, and you have to have visibility. But that doesn't mean lots and lots of compliance specs that are prescriptive, that are often dated, because you're dealing with very well-resourced nation states and non-nation state actors that change to be effective because they have a time and a budget and a boss too. And so they don't read our compliance pieces and say, we're very intimidated by your auditor's report. They scan the external part of your company and they say, you look like an easy mark and I'm gonna rob you. And they do. And I think we just have to acknowledge a lot of that. And that's gonna involve a lot of modernization of a lot of legacy types of IT and systems. At the same time, we're trying to go after all these sort of modernization efficiency initiatives. So we've gotta look more like the future and sort of do new better, but we have a lot of work to do to clean up the past where we never invested in it, and that's gonna take some time in doing.
On the space side, it's an interesting question that gets framed through the term mission assurance, right? How do you achieve your mission even though other people are trying to mess with you? And in space, historically, we've had these really large, super complex and capable systems that were basically single points of failure, which made them very, very, General Hyten would call them big juicy targets, right, for exploitation on the cyber side as well as the kinetic side. And what you're starting to see on the space side, because, they're space people, and the space community, if you know the space community, is like a very weird community of like insular weirdness. And so, what the space community is now doing is trying to think about how they diversify their architectures, right? And so you see things like the DoD looking at, can Starlink provide a capability for us? Can, a proliferated low Earth orbit constellation do missile warning where it was previously not thought of? I think what's really interesting, and I think I'm on another panel on space tomorrow, so you'll have more space nerdiness. But at the end of the day, what should really be happening is not just kind of space for space's sake, because space is awesome and cool and we all love to be in space, but like, if you're trying to get that capability, how can you push that across other domains as well? So don't just have a space capability that can be hacked in space, but also make sure that you have backup or redundant architecture in aerostats, in the air domain. Quite frankly, undersea is a completely undervalued domain in whatever the DoD is now calling the Joint All-Domain Command and Control operations, right? I think space and undersea are probably the two most neglected domains in that conceptualization and in all of the programmatic instantiations. And it gets back to building the resilience across multiple architectures, because the bar for entry on these cyber hackers is so low compared to the investment that we're making in the weapon systems themselves.
Yeah, one thing that you touched on as well, the big juicy target piece, right? I mean, you're seeing like all this innovation in microsats versus just,
Right.
think of how big the Air Force TSATs were, right? I mean, these things are literally the size of a bus before they put, the actual, solar collectors out, right? They're just huge, right? Compared to CubeSats, right? But one of the other things I think I would remember in thinking about this stuff is that you have to do the fundamentals well, right? So as an example, the Zero Trust initiative that the president announced, that there was interim guidance that was put out. Well, when the Zero Trust guidance that was put out, which was ostensibly to combat the SolarWinds issues that happened from Russia last year, was recently published for comment, it didn't actually address the core forgery techniques for authentication events that all the computers in the federal government use. Problem, right? So we have to make sure we actually get to the real depth that's there and not the buzzword bingo stuff that goes on in investor land. And I think this is where DoD's got to be really careful that it's investing in fundamentals and holding new companies to the same kind of standards it would hold a Pratt or an Electric Boat or some of the other companies that we had sitting up here earlier when they're fielding systems that they're expected to support over their lifetime, not Hail Mary throws into the end of the end zone, we'll see if it works or not. And that's going to require a different kind of discipline maybe, and I don't think it's just about playing venture capitalist.
By the way, if folks are interested in learning more about resilience, I would recommend a reading for you, and I'll show my bias because MITRE, my former organization, actually had a role in helping the government work with industry and the government to create this, but there's a NIST standard for a set of guidelines, if you will, for cyber resilience, which has got literally dozens of methods. And some of them were mentioned, methods like redundancy, but also diversity, also disaggregation, and a multiplicity of other methods, which actually are quite effective at the mission assurance that was referenced. We maybe have time for one more question if it's burning. Otherwise, I'm going to close. I don't see any hands. So I want to close on a positive note. So I'm going to ask a question of both Sarah and Jason, which is, and we didn't talk about this before, so you're going to have to think on your feet here. So what are the most hopeful things that you see in national and global innovation? You know, private-public partnerships, next-generation leaders, or other things. Where leave us at the end of this challenging conversation with hope for the future.
Well, maybe I'll go first, and then Sarah can close it out. I think, my view on this is that this maybe goes back to where we started, which is what's the world that we want to live in. A lot of the technology that we talk about, especially in the digital space, or in a lot of the more modern mechanical instruments and robotics and all these other great new things that are coming around, right? All the new space technology allows us to see our world in a totally different way, see our universe in a different way. This is all about, at least to me, elevating the way that we spend the time that all of us sentient beings get to spend. We only get so much of it. And if more of that's spent on asking really interesting questions and thinking about being creative and forming the kind of world that we want to live in, and putting more and more of the drudgery into the mechanical systems that can go out and be your virtual doppelganger, I think that's a good thing. And so, at least for me, I think we're going to see a lot of very narrow applications. I think we also are going to have to get really comfortable and start teaching technologists to think about how those things impact society. And if we do that, I'm pretty optimistic about the future.
Give us some hope. Last word.
Well, you asked the wrong person. I mean, I basically, I spent my career in doom and gloom in the intelligence community, nuclear weapons, and missile defense. And so I'm good on the doom and gloom part. I will tell you, I think that the thing that gives me hope is not so much the innovation that I see occurring, because I think that's pretty natural. It's the innovators that I see. And it's that next generation of innovators that are coming up. They're imaginative, they're actually interested in action, because it's not just about, imagineering your future, right? It's about actually creating it. It's the support networks that they're organically forming across the industry. That can be, quite frankly, pretty brutal out in the private sector, and the VC-funded kind of ecosystem out there can be pretty cutthroat. But there is a tremendous amount of hope and support among the individuals. And quite frankly, I see that really reflected not only with the colleagues that I get to work with at my company, but also across the government, and I get to see reflected in my kids, and that's all I could ask for.
It's a beautiful thought. Jason and Sarah, thank you so much. Let me just close by, first of all, again, thanking the organizers and expressing my gratitude to our panelists, but also to our host, to the Kinetic Science Center. It's, as I said before, a privilege to serve and work for Matt Fleury and his great team here. I also have the privilege to work on a board about a mile away from here, the Mark Twain Museum. So we opened with Hercules, but I think we have to close with Twain. And Twain is so great. You got to get him two quotes. So one, I'm going to reflect on our uniformed personnel, our foreign national, I believe, and unless you got your green card already. But what country, ma'am, are you from?
We represent Romania, honorary consul of Romania over
Brilliant. Okay, Honorary Consulate of Romania. Well, you would no doubt would appreciate Samuel Cleven's comment that travel is fatal to prejudice. And I think, sort of echoing some of my colleagues' comments about diversity, clearly having a better engagement and hopeful engagement with our international colleagues is I think, also part of this puzzle. But let me close just by saying that, because America is the greatest, the business of America is business. Mark Twain also said, prosperity is the best protector of principle. So may I wish all of you a prosperous future, a successful tomorrow, and a much happier and healthier future for all of us. So with that, please join me in thanking our panelists, and thank you all for your attention.